On a Tuesday morning in August of 1989, Ray Fontenot stood at the edge of a Louisiana bayou and watched his career disappear into the mud. 4 days earlier, his company's newest piece of equipment, a Liebherr LTM 1200 crane, $650,000 of hydraulic precision, had broken through what the surveyors guaranteed was stable ground on the bank of Bayou Teche. The machine had gone down fast, its 70-ton weight punching through the thin crust of dried clay into the soft black mud beneath. Now it sat in the bayou like a dead animal, buried past its cab, its yellow paint streaked with Louisiana mud the color of dark coffee, its tracks invisible beneath the surface. Every hour it sank another inch. Ray was 47 years old and had built Fontenot heavy construction from nothing. One truck, one backhoe, 20 years of 16-hour days until he was the biggest contractor in St. Mary Parish. He employed 180 men, he had built levees and bridges and drainage canals across South Louisiana. Ray Fontenot did not lose equipment, he did not run out of options. But on that Tuesday morning in August, that is exactly where he stood. On the first day, he had brought in 2 Caterpillar D9 bulldozers and chained them to the stuck crane. The bulldozers had pulled until their own tracks started slipping in the bayou mud, until the chains groaned and one of them snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The crane had not moved a single inch. On the second day, he called a recovery company from Baton Rouge, specialists. They arrived with a 60-ton winch truck and spent 8 hours anchoring it to a concrete pad. They poured themselves on higher ground. The winch screamed, the cable stretched, the anchor cracked and shifted, the crane sank another 8 inches. On the third day, Ray rented a second crane to lift the first one. The second crane's operator took one look at the bayou bank, shook his head, and refused to get within 150 feet of the edge. "That ground won't hold me," he said. "You want 2 cranes in the mud instead of 1. Now Ray stood with his engineers on the 4th day, and nobody had anything useful to say. "Helicopter," one engineer offered. "The crane weighs 70 tons rigged. The heaviest helicopter lift ever done in Louisiana was 28 tons. You'd need 3 working simultaneously. Not possible." "Drain the area." "We're next to a bayou fed by the Atchafalaya Basin. We'd pump forever." "Insurance." Ray laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Insurance doesn't cover operator error, and driving onto unstable ground counts as operator error." The engineers fell silent. Every day the crane sat in the mud cost Ray $22,000 in project delays. His reputation in St. Mary Parish, built over 20 years, was sitting on its side in the bayou along with his equipment. That was when the old Ford tractor came rattling down the access road. Let me tell you about Ezra Thibodaux, because you need to understand who he was before you can understand what he did. Ezra was 76 years old and had farmed 380 acres of sugarcane on the east side of Bayou Teche for 51 years. His land bordered the construction site on the south. He had watched Ray Fontenot's crews arrive 6 months earlier, watched them grade and survey and bring in equipment that cost more than his entire farm. He had said nothing when the construction traffic tore up the parish road his family had been driving since 1908. Said nothing when the vibration from the pile drivers cracked a window in his barn. Ezra Thibodaux was not a complainer, he was a watcher. For 4 days he had been watching from his back porch, drinking coffee and observing a $650,000 crane sink into Bayou Teche mud while modern machinery and modern expertise accomplished nothing. He had watched the bulldozers spin their tracks, watched the winch cable stretch and fail, watched the second crane drive away. And the whole time he was watching, he was thinking about a machine sitting in his equipment shed that had been built for exactly this kind of problem. Ezra's grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Thibodaux, had purchased a 1931 Bucyrus-Erie Model 10B dragline in 1934, during the worst of the Depression, for $1,100, money scraped together from 4 years of sugarcane harvests. A dragline was not a common purchase for a Louisiana farm, but Jean-Baptiste had watched the bayou flood his fields 3 times in 8 years, and he had decided he was going to do something about it. The dragline would dig drainage ditches, would clear blocked bayou channels, would move the mud and clay that flooded his sugarcane year after year. The machine was remarkable for its era. It weighed 18 tons on 2 steel tracks, each one 14 feet long and 22 inches wide. It ran on a 4-cylinder gasoline engine that produced 55 horsepower, not impressive by any modern standard, but it operated on a principle completely different from hydraulic cranes and bulldozers. The dragline used cables. A long boom extended from the machine's body, and from that boom hung a bucket on wire rope. The bucket was dragged back toward the machine by a drag cable, scooping material as it came. The whole system was mechanical, cables and drums and gears with no hydraulics, no sensors, no computers. Jean-Baptiste had used it for 20 years. Ezra's father, Claude, had used it for another 20. And Ezra had been using it since 1963 for every job on the farm where nothing else would do, pulling combines out of flooded fields, dredging blocked drainage ditches, moving things that had no intention of being moved. The machine had been rebuilt twice, once in 1951 and once in 1977, when Ezra and a retired Bucyrus-Erie mechanic from Morgan City spent a winter replacing every bearing, rebuilding the engine, replacing the cables. The restoration cost $2,800 and 6 months of weekend work. Since then, Ezra had fired it up once a month and used it 4 or 5 times a year for heavy work. Most people who saw it thought it belonged in a museum. Ezra knew what it could do. He drove his old Ford to the construction site on the 4th morning, parked at the fence line and walked over to where Ray Fontenot stood with his engineers. "Morning," Ezra said. Ray barely looked at him. "Morning, site's closed, insurance." "I'm your neighbor, farm on the south side." Ezra nodded toward the bayou. "Been watching, looks like you've got a problem." "We're working on it." "You've been working on it for 4 days, crane's still in the mud." Ray looked at him properly for the first time. Worn overalls, rubber boots caked with bayou mud, a face that had spent 76 years in South Louisiana sun and not bothered to hide any of it. "What's your point?" "I can pull that crane out." The engineers exchanged looks. One of them coughed. Ray Fontenot started to laugh, a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine disbelief rather than cruelty. "You can pull that crane out," Ray repeated. "With what?" "My dragline, 1931 Bucyrus-Erie. She's been on my farm since my grandfather bought her new." The laughter spread from Ray to the engineers to the workers who had stopped to listen. A 1931 dragline pulling a modern 70-ton crane out of a Louisiana bayou. The image was genuinely funny to everyone who heard it. "My bulldozers make more horsepower than your whole farm," Ray said, wiping his eyes. "They couldn't move that crane an inch. What makes you think a machine from 1931 is going to do better?" Ezra looked at the stuck crane, then at the useless bulldozers at the bayou's edge, then back at Ray with the patience of a man who has been right about things for a long time and has learned not to need other people to know it. "Your machines pull with hydraulics," Ezra said. "Mine pulls with cables, different principle entirely." "Enlighten me." "Hydraulics push and pull in straight lines. Maximum force then failure, a hose blows or an anchor pulls loose and it's over. Cables are different. A cable system multiplies force through mechanical advantage. My dragline boom is 40 feet long. The cable runs from the drum up to the boom tip, back down to the load. That geometry multiplies my pulling force, and cables have give. When the load shifts or the mud releases in sections, the cable absorbs the shock instead of snapping." Ray had stopped smiling. "The geometry doesn't change the horsepower." "No, but it changes how the force is applied. Your equipment applies maximum force all at once. My dragline applies sustained force through a mechanical advantage that your hydraulic systems can't replicate, and there's something else." Ezra nodded toward the bayou bank. "Your machines are too heavy. Their ground pressure punched through that crust. My dragline is 18 tons on 14-foot tracks. My ground pressure is 400 pounds per square foot. Your crane's outrigger pads were putting 3,000 pounds per square foot on the same soil. That's why you went in. That's why I won't." One of the engineers had pulled out a notebook. He was writing. "How does a sugarcane farmer know the ground pressure specs of his own equipment?" Ray asked. "Because I've been pulling things out of bayou mud for 51 years, Ezra said, "and I've been stuck exactly once. I learned what I needed to learn." Ray looked at the crane, at his engineers, at the man in worn overalls who had just explained his problem more precisely than any of the specialists he had called. "If it doesn't work," Ray started. "Then you've lost nothing but a morning," Ezra said. "I'm not charging you. If it works, make a donation to the St. Mary Parish Historical Society. They helped me restore the machine." Ray looked at his engineers. One shrugged, another nodded slightly, the universal gesture of men who have run out of better ideas. "Bring your museum piece," Ray said, but the mockery had left his voice. "Let me tell you about the Bucyrus-Erie, because it is the real reason this story is still being told." The 1931 Bucyrus-Erie Model 10B dragline had been manufactured in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the same year that Babe Ruth hit his 600th home run, and the Empire State Building opened in New York City. It was built in an era when American industry believed that machines should be simple enough that the men who used them could understand every component. No black boxes, no proprietary systems, no sensors that protected the machine from the demands placed on it. The boom was fabricated steel lattice construction, 40 feet of it bolted together in sections. The cables were steel wire rope, replaceable and adjustable. The drums that wound and unwound the cables were driven by the engine through a gearbox that Ezra could describe from memory, every shaft and bearing and gear ratio. The whole machine was, in the language of its era, honest. It showed you exactly what it was doing and why, and it did not stop doing it until you told it to or something broke. Jean-Baptiste Thibodaux had operated it from a seat exposed to the Louisiana elements, sun and rain and biohumidity, for 20 years. He had said the machine taught you to pay attention because there was nothing between you and the work. No cab, no climate control, no instruments beyond a few gauges, just the cable tension in your hands through the levers and the sound of the engine, and the sight of the bucket doing what you directed it to do. Ezra had inherited that education. He could read a load through the lever the way a physician reads a pulse. He knew what the engine sounded like at the edge of its capacity and what it sounded like with room to spare. He knew how bayou mud behaved under sustained cable tension, how it released in sections rather than all at once, how you could feel the sections releasing through the cable before you could see the load move. It took Ezra 2 hours to bring the dragline from his farm to the construction site. The machine moved at 4 miles per hour on its steel tracks, clinking and clanking down the parish road, leaving a trail of pressed earth behind it. Drivers pulled over to watch. 2 children on bicycles followed it for half a mile. Nobody in St. Mary Parish had seen a Bucyrus-Erie dragline traveling a public road in 30 years. The construction crew heard it before they saw it. A deep mechanical clanking, rhythmic and unhurried, like something enormous and patient moving toward a job it had been waiting for. Then the machine itself came over the levee road and into view, and for a moment everyone on the site simply stared. It was not as large as Ray's crane had been, but it was serious in a way that was hard to articulate. Massive steel tracks, the long lattice boom folded down for travel, the cable drums visible and substantial, everything exposed and purposeful. It looked like it had been built to do difficult work and had been doing it without interruption for 58 years. Ray Fontenot stood with his arms crossed, watching. His skepticism had not disappeared, but it had changed character. It was now the skepticism of a man who is genuinely uncertain rather than the skepticism of a man who is certain he is right. "Jesus," one of the engineers said quietly, "look at that thing." "It's an antique," Ray said, but his voice was different from 4 hours earlier. Ezra positioned the dragline on higher ground about 180 feet from the stuck crane on the levee road where the ground was solid and compacted. He set his travel brakes, climbed down from the operator's seat, and began paying out the drag cable from the rear drum. The cable was 3 4-inch steel wire rope, 300 feet of it on the drum, the same cable Ezra had installed during the 1977 restoration. He had tested it the previous spring, rated for 22 tons. "That cable won't hold," one of Ray's engineers said. "We snapped a cable rated for 30 tons. "Your cable snapped because it ran over the bayou bank edge under full tension," Ezra said, feeding the cable out by hand. Feeling its weight and condition as it ran through his fingers, the edge acted like a knife. The cable cut itself on its own load. "I'm not going over that edge. My cable runs from my drum up to my boom tip and back down to the load. The angle of pull distributes the tension differently. No single point takes the full load." He walked the cable out toward the crane, not directly, at an angle, staying on firmer ground, testing each step with his boot before trusting his weight to it. The engineers watched him pick his way across the bayou bank with the careful attention of someone reading ground that nobody else could read. He hooked the cable to the crane's main frame at a point below the center of gravity. Not the highest point, not the lowest, the point that, given the angle of lean and the position of the cab, would translate the cable's horizontal pull into the rotational force needed to bring the machine upright rather than simply dragging it sideways. "Why there?" Ray asked. "Because that crane isn't just stuck, it's tipped. I need to right it before I can move it. That attachment point gives me the mechanical advantage to start a rotation. Once the crane's center of gravity shifts back past the tipping point, its own weight brings it the rest of the way up." Ray was quiet. "Your engineers were trying to drag it out horizontally," Ezra continued. You can't drag a 70-ton machine horizontally out of mud that deep. You have to rock it first, break the mud's suction in stages, get it moving in the axis it naturally wants to move in. He looked at Ray. The bayou mud has the crane in a grip. You don't break that grip all at once. You work it, the way you work anything that doesn't want to move. He walked back to the dragline, climbed into the operator's seat, checked his cable angle, and put his hand on the drag lever. "Ready," he called. Ray looked at his engineers. Both of them nodded, barely perceptibly. "Go ahead," Ray said. "Let me tell you about the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, because they are the reason people in St. Mary Parish still talk about this day." Ezra engaged the drag drum. The cable came taut with the slow, absolute certainty of something that does not hurry because it does not need to, not a snap, not a jerk. A gradual, increasing tension that ran from the drum through the boom tip and back down to the crane frame in one long continuous line. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then the cable began to sing, a low, sustained hum just audible above the engine, the sound of steel wire rope approaching its working load, every strand pulling. The dragline's tracks pressed into the levee road. The boom flexed slightly under the load. And the crane moved. Not dramatically, a quarter inch maybe, a slight rotation of the massive frame in the mud, the upper structure shifting fractionally toward vertical. "It's moving," someone said very quietly. Ezra did not react. He was watching the cable angle, feeling the drum tension through the lever, listening to the engine. He kept the drag pressure absolutely steady, not increasing, not decreasing, just holding. The crane moved again, half an inch, then an inch. The mud around it shifted, the surface tension breaking in a small circle around the machine's base. A sound came from the crane, a deep, liquid groan. The sound of 70 tons of steel beginning to argue with several thousand square feet of bayou mud that had been holding it for 4 days. Ezra increased the drag tension slightly, 1/4 of a lever movement. The engine note deepened. 10 minutes in, the crane had rotated 3 degrees back toward vertical, not visible to the eye but measurable by the change in the cable angle. Ezra could feel it through the lever. 20 minutes in, 5 degrees. The mud around the crane's base was showing hairline cracks, the suction breaking in sections as Ezra had known it would. Ray Fontenot had stopped standing with his arms crossed. He was standing with his hands at his sides, watching the cable, watching the crane, watching an old man on an old machine do something quietly and methodically that all his modern equipment had failed to do. At 40 minutes, the crane had rotated 8 degrees. The upper structure was visibly different. Anyone watching closely could see that the angle had changed, that the machine was moving toward upright rather than simply sitting. At 55 minutes, Ezra stopped the drag drum, shifted the dragline's position slightly, moving it 3 feet to the left to change the cable angle and resume tension. The geometry of the pull had shifted. Now he was applying force in a slightly different direction, attacking the mud's grip from a new angle, the way you work a stuck lid by applying pressure in sequence rather than all at once. The crane groaned again, this time louder. "She's coming," Ezra said quietly, to no one in particular. At 1 hour and 20 minutes, the crane rotated past its balance point. The center of gravity shifted to the correct side of the tipping axis. And then, with a sound like a large animal exhaling, a deep, wet, releasing sound, the bayou mud let go. The crane came upright in 4 seconds. It rocked once forward and back, then settled onto its tracks on the bayou bank, muddy and battered but standing, upright, on solid ground for the first time in 4 days. The construction crew erupted. Men who had been watching in tense silence were suddenly shouting, grabbing each other, pointing at the crane and at the dragline and at the old man in the operator's seat who was already letting tension out of the cable and beginning to assess what needed to happen next. Some of the workers were laughing, some were not. The ones who were not were the ones who understood or were beginning to understand what they had just watched. Ray Fontenot did not cheer. He stood at the edge of the bayou bank and looked at his crane standing on its own tracks, and then at the dragline, and then at Ezra Thibodaux beginning the methodical process of securing his cable and checking his equipment after the job. Ray walked to the dragline. Ezra climbed down when he saw Ray coming. They stood at the base of the machine, the boom overhead, the cable still running down to the now upright crane. Ray stuck out his hand. Ezra shook it. "How much do I owe you?" Ray said. "I told you, donation to the Historical Society." "How much?" What did 4 days of delays cost you? Close to $90,000. Give them $12,000, they've never seen money like that. They want to build a proper equipment barn at the parish fairgrounds. Ray pulled out his checkbook without hesitation. He wrote the check, tore it off, held it toward Ezra. $12,000 to the St. Mary Parish Historical Society, he said, and my personal thanks. Ezra took the check. Most people forget, he said. I won't, Ray said. He looked at the dragline. How did your grandfather know this machine could do this? Ezra leaned against the dragline's track. He didn't know it would do this specifically. He bought it to dig drainage ditches, but he understood the principle: cables and mechanical advantage. He used to say that hydraulics were faster but cables were smarter. Hydraulics push until something gives the load or the hose. Cables pull until the geometry works in your favor. Given time, geometry always wins. Given time, Ray repeated. We didn't have time. You had 4 days, Ezra said, and you spent them fighting the problem. I spent 2 hours working with it. Ray was quiet for a moment. 30 years in this business, built my company from nothing. I've always believed that the newest equipment was the most capable. He looked at the crane, upright now, being examined by his crew. Today, a machine built before my father was born did what $650,000 of modern equipment couldn't. Your equipment is better for most work, Ezra said. Faster, more precise, safer for the operators. I'm not saying old is always better. He looked at Ray. I'm saying every tool has the job it was built for. Your crane was built to lift in controlled conditions. My dragline was built to move things in mud and water and difficult ground. Today was a difficult ground day. How do I know which day is which? Ray asked. Ezra smiled. You ask the people who have been working this ground longer than you have. Ray Fontenot wrote a letter to the president of his company that evening describing what had happened. The letter recommended that Fontenot Heavy Construction develop a relationship with older contractors and equipment operators in every parish where they worked, people who knew the local ground conditions from experience rather than from soil surveys. The recommendation was adopted. It was, Ray said later, the most important letter he ever wrote. Let me tell you about the years that followed. The St. Mary Parish Historical Society received Ray Fontenot's check on a Friday afternoon and used it, along with other donations it generated over the following years, to build a proper equipment barn at the parish fairgrounds. The 1931 Bucyrus-Erie dragline was the first machine displayed in the new barn, not permanently, because Ezra Thibodaux still used it and had no intention of donating it to anyone. But the society built a special display for it with photographs from the bayou rescue and the documentation of its 58-year working history. The plaque at the base of the display read, Bucyrus-Erie Model 10B Dragline 1931. Owner, Ezra Thibodaux, St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, built before the Second World War, still working, has recovered equipment that modern technology could not move. Some things do not become obsolete, they wait for people to remember what they were built for. Ray Fontenot's crane required repairs, hydraulic damage, some structural work on the undercarriage, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. It was back in service within 3 weeks. The bridge project finished on schedule. Ray made his deadline, though he did not advertise how. Ezra Thibodaux farmed his sugarcane until 2001, when he was 88 years old and his son Marcel convinced him that perhaps the body had earned the right to rest. He sold his equipment, most of it to neighboring farmers and young men starting out. He kept the dragline. It went to Marcel, who had grown up watching his father operate it and had learned the machine the way the Thibodaux family had always learned things, by doing the work alongside someone who knew it. Ray Fontenot came to the farm when Ezra was 91, 3 years before Ezra died. He drove down from New Iberia on a Sunday afternoon with no particular agenda except to see the old man and the old machine. Ezra was on the porch in the August heat, watching the cane grow the way old men watch things when they have nothing left to prove. They talked for 2 hours, about the bayou, about the dragline, about the parish road and the sugar cane and the way South Louisiana ground behaved after a wet spring. And at the end of the visit, just before Ray got back in his truck, he said something to Ezra that Ezra repeated to Marcel the following week. I spent 30 years thinking experience was something you replaced with technology, Ray said. You taught me that technology is something you add to experience, not the other way around. Ezra Thibodaux died in 2006 at the age of 93. His funeral was held at the Catholic Church in Centerville that his grandfather Jean-Baptiste had helped build in 1902. Ray Fontenot drove 3 hours to attend. At the reception afterward, he found Marcel Thibodaux and handed him a check. "What's this?" Marcel asked. "The money your father refused to take in 1989 plus 17 years of interest. I want it to go to whatever cause he would have chosen." Marcel looked at the check, $45,000. "The delays that crane cost me came to $90,000. Without your father it would have cost me everything. $45,000 is half what I owe." Marcel thought about it. Papa always gave to the Parish Historical Society and to the 4-H program. He believed in teaching young people how old equipment worked. "Then split it," Ray said, "and put a note with the 4-H portion that says it's from Ezra Thibodaux' dragline, the machine that taught me that geometry beats horsepower every time." The 1931 Bucyrus-Erie dragline is still on the Thibodaux farm. Marcel fires it up once a month. He has used it 11 times since his father stopped farming, twice to clear blocked drainage ditches on the property, 4 times to help neighbors whose modern equipment couldn't reach a job, and 5 times to demonstrate it at the parish fair, where children climb on the tracks and ask questions and old men remember. In 2018, a pipeline construction company working near Bayou Teche got a crane stuck in the mud. They tried bulldozers, the bulldozers spun. They tried a winch truck, the cables snapped. They called a second crane. The second crane's operator refused to approach the bank. On the third day, a younger man on the construction crew said he had heard a story. Something his grandfather had told him about a time in 1989 when a similar thing had happened on Bayou Teche and an old man with an old dragline had come and done what nobody else could do. The crew chief made a phone call. Marcel Thibodaux answered on the second ring. He brought the dragline to the site 2 hours later, moving at 4 miles per hour down the parish road, clinking and clanking the way it always had, the way it had when Ezra drove it and Jean-Baptiste before him. Drivers pulled over to watch. Children pointed. Nobody in St. Mary Parish had seen a Bucyrus-Erie dragline on a public road in years. The construction crew heard it before they saw it. A deep mechanical clanking, rhythmic and patient, moving toward a job it had been built to do. 2 hours and 15 minutes later, the crane was out. Same technique, same cable, same geometry, same principle that Jean-Baptiste Thibodaux had understood when he bought this machine in 1934, and that Ezra had refined over 51 years, and that Marcel had inherited, and that the Bucyrus-Erie company had built into the machine's design in 1931, because in 1931 they understood that some problems require patience and mechanical advantage rather than horsepower and speed. The crew chief shook Marcel's hand when it was over. "Your grandfather pulled a crane out of this same bayou," the crew chief said. "My father," Marcel said, "my grandfather built the ditches." "Same machine. Same machine." The crew chief looked at the dragline for a long moment. "How old is it?" 87 years old, Marcel said, "and still the only thing that works when nothing else does." The engineers said it was impossible. The modern equipment said it was too much. The bayou mud said it was permanent. The 1931 dragline said nothing, it just pulled. That is the difference between machines that protect themselves and machines that do the work. Between technology designed for normal conditions and equipment built for the moments when nothing is normal. Between the newest thing money can buy and the right thing for the job. The bayou is still there, the mud is still deep. And in a shed on the Thibodaux farm in St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, a 1931 Bucyrus-Erie dragline is waiting. Its cables are sound, its engine starts on the third pull, its boom is 40 feet of honest steel that has never once failed to do what was asked of it. And every time someone stands at the edge of a Louisiana bayou and says nothing can pull that out, the Thibodaux family fires up the dragline, pays out the cable and proves them wrong. They always prove them wrong.